Day 5, American Women from the Gail Collins book. So I'm going to start off with this chart here, the vicious cycle, as well as this chart here, which raised some controversy in 2020. So with this chart, the vicious cycle, it starts with prejudice, discrimination, individual acts. So I always think of these as like individual acts, choices that people are making. And the choices that people are making eventually spill over into big institutions, because ultimately big institutions are controlled by human beings. And those big institutions could be like the military, they could be corporate America, and in this case, the institution of slavery. And as a result of the social disadvantages and the barriers, the targeted group develops a belief in inferiority. And then, oddly, that belief in inferiority almost acts as a justification for the individual prejudice and discriminatory acts that people make. Uh, in this particular chart here, I want to focus on the line. People were really upset about this because they felt anything above the line was associated with bad people. So we see like upper class and the opposite, poor, white, non-white, heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and that there was a judgment being made about, the good people in comparison to the bad. So I'm going to come back to this later on. Primarily this, I just want to recap where we left off from last class and some of the items that you should know. The Cult of True Womanhood, which is pretty much the four virtues, and Abigail Adams, her request to not forget the women when they create the new government, which was rejected, and her husband all but laughed. We also talked about Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton trying to speak at an anti-slavery convention, and the organizers of this convention did not want to add another issue. They only wanted to focus on the fight to end slavery. And as a result of that, eventually these women find themselves at Seneca Falls, where we see the birth of the women's rights movement that starts to take place. Seneca Falls is also associated with the Womanifesto, which is a document that will be used in a later class, possibly even on an assessment, and where she, takes the Declaration of Independence and she adds all men and women are created equal, and then she kind of goes on, arguing her particular point. Also, take note that in the 1800s we have the end of the Civil War, which is going to change the status of slavery in the United States when we have the 13th through 15th Amendments. That will be more of a Civil War class. This particular reading, we are also looking at the transition to, I said before, the women's rights movement. And we have two organizations, the NWSA and the AWSA. This one seemed to be primarily concerned with voting rights, while they are not only concerned with voting rights, but also divorce laws, discrimination, and equal pay. So if I was the male dominant society, I would probably be more concerned about this group as opposed to this group here, because this group is only concerned about the right to vote, whereas this group really wants to change the entire society and the system that is set in place that's impacting women. None of that matters though, because eventually both of these groups merge and they create the organization, the NAWSA, which is going to be the group that's fighting in the 1920s, prior to the 1920s, for the right to vote. I'm also under the assumption that many of you have watched the film Iron Jawed Angels. So these are the items that you need to address for this particular class. And I'm going to look at some of those items. Slave breaking, which is kind of linked to this one. How did Africans carve up the best world? So I'm going to come back to that particular point. According to the reading, it talked about, certain Sunday clothing and colors. And so if we're looking at the world here, and we have people coming from Africa to what's called the New World. The question here is, at which point are they going to lose their African identity? And this probably will be a not a choice for generations after groups start to come over from Africa, but for the people first generation, they're trying to maintain their cultural identity, which is the point that's being addressed here. So when I use the phrase carving out the best world, this will be a race issue where some of those African tribes are really struggling with trying to maintain their cultural identity, which is why I linked it to this particular point here as generations start to come into existence. You possibly become further removed. Now I just throw in some other scenarios like this because I'm also addressing another component that's in the reading that I will come back to in a second. Anyway, so for slave breaking, I mean, the summary for slave breaking, it's a practice to make sure that your slave was obedient. What you're looking at here is a receipt for a slave breaking service. If you click this link, it would take you to the film Roots, where they're trying to break one of the slaves for not following orders. And so, what's the link to carving up the best world? It was really just in a horrific time of slavery that some of the Africans tried to maintain their African origins. What did it mean to be African? What does it mean to be African American? And you see that outlined in the reading. And as this reading gets to the end, we start to see more horrific things start to emerge as we look at the reading that addressed the issue of rape and coercion. So apologize for using the diagrams here, but the reading does address these items. So you are expected to know the role of sex with regard to the various roles here. And I will be using references from the reading just to try to help me understand kind of what's going on here. So let's take a look at this chart here. These two, I'm just going to label them A and B. So in this situation, you can look at this as free, and maybe this is the slave master, and here we have the slave, here we have the slave, and here we have a white woman. And in both cases, we have an offspring that's half black and half white. That is potentially problematic. So the question here is, if we're looking at birth, the childbirth, and if status is determined by the male, that would mean that in this situation, the child would be born free. That is a potential problem, and it is a threat to the institution of slavery. So there's something called the slave codes. Let's see what comes up when we search slave codes. When we look up slave codes, we come up with something. Here just talks about laws, slavery, and enslaved people. And the slave laws, the slave codes are significant because it's the way this country transitions to what becomes known as permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. The first Africans coming over here, they're not slaves, and their children are not going to be slaves, and it's not permanent. That process takes place in the early 1600s, going all the way up until about the 1680s. And it's just a series of laws that slowly, one by one, take away the status of the freed African and transition to a permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. So these check marks, think of them as laws, and each law strips away another, situation or makes something illegal that slowly transitions us to this. So in this scenario, as I said before, the child would be born free. So one of the slave codes that's passed is to suggest that the status of the child would be determined by the mother. So now is where this really starts to get nasty, because in this image here, and one of the things we'll be looking at is a book, White Women, Black Men, by Hodes and Sharon Block's Rape and Sexual Power. I think that's the name of that book. Anyway, so in this image here, what's going on is the slave master is going into the slave quarters and forcing the slave into a sexual act, at which point the wife's husband is completely powerless and is out in the field crying. That's what the reading addressed. Now, keep in mind, a slave marriage recognized by the state, the phrase jumping the broom, that's what's going on here. This is a slave marriage. And keep in mind that although these individuals are married, that the slave master pretty much has more power than the husband. And so that's what's going on. And the reading did address that, that the males felt powerless in that situation. So here, once you change the law, the slave code, now we have status determined by the woman. And we already know that the woman is a slave. So in that particular case, the child would be a slave and pretty much at the mercy of the dad. Is the dad going to free the child? Is the dad going to take care of the child? Or is the dad going to recognize the child? Recognition is problematic because if we recognize the child, um, as the offspring of this particular male, then that child becomes evidence of what's going on. And what's going on is black and white are engaging in sexual acts. And the offspring becomes the evidence, the half black, half white that is addressed in the reading. And they will come back to that in a minute. Now, in this situation, you might think, well, all right, well, what's going on here? You have to remember that the woman is subjected to coverture, so her status would be determined by the male. And so let's just say if she's willing to get married to a slave, then that means her status would be determined through coverture by the husband. That would make now this woman a slave. So let's take a situation where the slave master has a wife and the wife is in love with a slave over here, and she is willing to try to get a divorce if that's allowed. And let's just say she is able to get the divorce, and she decides that she wants to get married. I mean, it's not going to happen, but if it does happen, now that pretty much means that she is a slave. This individual owns this slave here, which would then make both of them his slave. So it's a system that's kind of put in place that all roads pretty much are going to end back to this. And for the white female, what that means is she has so much to lose. The thought, the likelihood of this happening here in comparison to this is less than this. This is going to happen more often than this because the woman in this situation has everything to lose. You know, she's going to be labeled an outcast to society. She runs the risk of her social status being determined by the husband. So in this case, it's not in her best interest. So this is going to be less likely. Or in a scenario where they're caught in the act, it might be a situation where she might just say, you know what, this individual forced me into that particular act. So according to the Southern way of life, this situation seems to be more threatening because if the woman is willing to go through all of those barriers, then that really says something about the situation. Whereas here, it seems to be more about force. And what the end result becomes is that this really sets up black and white relations throughout history. I chose this particular image here with LeBron James posing on Vogue because, you know, regardless of what the magazine was about, everybody just kept talking about the situation with, you know, the black man with the white woman, even though there was no, you know, relationship between the individuals. It was really just about you know, just the visual. And again, here's that book, White Women, Black Men, that we'll be looking at, and it will get to that particular point. So when we look at the response here, this is kind of what you're responsible for, that the victim's husband is powerless. And then the half-born, the half-black, half-white becomes the actual evidence. And we see that playing out in the reading here. You know, it talks about a woman trying to repulse her master, risk the beating. So she is going to, you know, have to submit through force. Uh, Here it talks about the master seldom acknowledged their illegitimate children. So the master is in this situation having his way with the slave woman, and you know, there's just nothing that can be done, and the child is just not going to be recognized. Once she winds up pregnant, that means that the status by this individual will be determined by the mom, which was the whole point of passing that particular um, slave code. Let's see. So in this particular section here, um, looking at this section here, the half-white child, um, and then you can kind of just see here the resentment towards the biracial child here really seems to be about what that child represents. And that's why I use the language. The child becomes the evidence of what's going on here. So let's see what else. So going back to the vicious cycle, the put yourself in that position of that female slave, and how she is going to feel with regard to the institution of slavery, putting her in that particular situation, and then how that is going to play out and possibly even lead to this and causing the cycle to just kind of repeat. What else did I miss? I think that was pretty much where we're at. So I wanted to show these episodes in class. White guilt, white liberal guilt is more of a 1970s term. And in this particular clip of Everybody Hates Chris, you kind of see that kind of playing out where it was more of an issue in the 70s. And so the whole point here is for white liberal guilt is that some white people feel responsible, indirectly responsible for what happened in the past because the history is horrific. And when we look at what's going on here, this is horrific. Imagine putting yourself in this woman's position. And so white liberal guilt is about looking at the past and trying to make amends and be apologetic about what had happened in the past. So I'm only bringing that up because in the 1970s, when we get to later units, that issue will be addressed. And that's pretty much it.